Welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to look at the newly released test framework in OpenTofu and show you how you can use it to have more confidence in your code changes. OpenTofu lets you create reusable, shareable modules to manage your configuration. As a module author, you want to have the highest confidence that any changes you make to your module don't introduce breaking changes for your users. OpenTofu has a number of ways to ensure that deployed configuration matches an expected state. However, the ability to verify changes and test module behavior before deploy time is important to ensure that what we give our users is stable and reliable. OpenTofu now ships with a new stable testing framework that allows us to verify the behavior of our module through a series of simulated tests. This enables us to validate our code path and reduce the risk of introducing breaking changes when we make module updates. In this video, we're going to look at two different types of fundamental testing principles: unit testing and integration testing. Let's look at the differences between the two. Simply put, unit testing allows us to test the behavior of our code. We use unit testing to validate that the logic that we've configured in our code is evaluated correctly. If we have logic in our code that behaves in a certain way based on the inputs, we use unit tests to assert that that behavior persists in a variety of different input scenarios. The main difference here is when we're running unit tests, we don't actually deploy anything. We simulate the module execution by providing input scenarios and then testing the output of that execution. While testing code behavior is indeed a vital part of our test requirements, verifying that the code is behaving correctly doesn't necessarily guarantee that the outcome will be of a desired result. Making sure that the logic inside our code matches the state of the desired outcome after deploy is where integration testing comes in. With integration testing, we spin up a one-time short-lived deployment where we can then proactively test that the end state of our deployed services are configured correctly. In this video, I'm going to show you how we can apply unit tests and integration tests to an OpenTofu module using the new testing feature. So let's jump in. So here I've got a fairly simple OpenTofu module that is going to be deploying a static website to an S3 bucket. Let's have a quick look around. We start off in tofu.tf. We can see that we're using the AWS provider. Now we can come over and see that we have a couple of input variables to this module. So we accept a region which defaults to EU West 1. And we've got this site name and environment variables. And for both of these variables, we have a validation statement. So here over in website TF is where we're configuring our S3 bucket and our website endpoint. So we have an AWS S3 bucket, which we've called website, and the bucket name is going to be an interpolation of the site name and environment variables. We then have some fairly boilerplate stuff just to set up permissions and ownership controls on the S3 bucket. And then down here we have the configuration which turns this S3 bucket into a website. So first we deploy an S3 object to the bucket, which is our index.html, which we can find here under site. And then we're adding some configuration to the S3 bucket to expose it as a website. And if we come over to the outputs.tf, we can see we've got an output that we've called endpoint, which is the website endpoint that comes from the website configuration object. So as a quick summary, we've got a couple of input variables here. Those input variables get interpolated into our bucket name here. We do a website configuration here, and then in the output of this module will be the endpoint of the website. So now I can check with Tofu plan by giving it the site name variable that everything is going to be working. So now we're going to dive in and write some tests for this module. So to start with, we're just going to, here in the root of our module, create a folder called tests. And then in that folder, we're going to create our first test file, which is going to be called website.tftest.hcl. When we run tofu test, it will scan this directory for any files that match that suffix. So the first thing we're going to do here is configure a provider block to bring in the AWS provider. So we don't have to specify a provider block here. If we omit this, then the test will use whatever providers we've got configured in our module. But there are some useful use cases for defining this here. For instance, we can use it to override parameters of the provider. So we can use it to put in some default tags that will just be used for our testing. So the first test I'm going to write here is a test that will validate the name of my bucket. So if we go back into website.tf here, we can see that we expect the bucket name to be site dash and then the site name dash the environment name dash HTML. So for my first test, I want to ensure that whatever changes I make to this module, that behavior persists. So I'm going to come back to my test file. And the first thing we're going to do is create a variables block where we're going to mock the inputs to the module that we're going to use for this test. So within the variables block, we can simply set our variables like this. So now we've got a site name of tofu test and an environment of QA. So now we've got the provider configured and we've got the inputs that we want to use for this test run. We can write our first actual test, and we do this using the run block. So here we specify run followed by a name, and then within this block is where we're going to define our test. So the first directive we're going to configure here is command. Now command can be plan or apply. So this is where the difference between unit testing and integration testing comes in. For this test, I just want to make sure that the logic of my code will configure the correct bucket name based on the inputs I've given. So for this test, I just want this to be a plan, which means it won't deploy any actual resources. So now we're going to write our assert block, which is where we're going to make our assertion. So the assert block contains two elements, the condition, which contains our evaluation, and the error message to display if that condition fails. So we'll start with the condition. And the condition based on the variables that we provided for input here will be that the bucket name for the website S3 bucket is going to be site-tofu-test-qa-html, as that matches the logic that I've coded. And then down here I can give an error message which we're going to throw if that condition is not met. And that's all we need here. We can just terminate the run block, and now we've got our first tofu test. Nope, looks like I'm also missing a terminating bracket here. So there we go. Now everything is passing syntax. We can save that. And now we come down to our terminal and we can simply run a tofu test. And we can see that it's picked up our tf test file here in our test directory, and it's found one test to run, valid bucket name, and that's passed. If I was to make some code change here that affected the interpolation of this variable, now we can come down here and run that again, we'll see that will fail. We can see that the condition was that the bucket should be this name, but it's resolved to this name, which is incorrect. So we're going to fix that back up for now. So now we've got our first unit test against our OpenTofu module. So here we've looked at testing things that execute correctly, but there are some conditions where we want to make sure that an execution fails. For example, here in variables.tf, I have some validation of my variables here that I want to throw an error if the criteria is not met. So I want to make sure that this validation is correct. So I want to make sure that it does actually fail under the conditions that it should. So I'm going to define a new run block here called site name validation. I'm going to set the command to plan. So the variables I defined above are the global variables that are going to be used by all of our tests, and they're correctly formatted variables. So in this test, I want to override the variable for site name, and I do that by defining a variables block within my run block, and I'm going to override site name to tofu.test, which if we go back to our variables.tf file, in site name, we're only allowing alphanumeric and underscore, so we should expect that to fail. So instead of the assert block that we used previously with the valid bucket name test, we're going to instead use a expect failures directive. And as an argument here, we give it the object that we expect to fail, which in this case is var.sitename. So that's our second test run. If we save that, we can then come back down to the terminal and run a second tofu test. And that test has passed, which means when we tried to pass tofu.test in as the site name, it generated a failure that was an expected failure, so the test has passed. So far we've looked at testing our code by evaluating the module execution and examining the outputs and behavior. So this is unit testing, but we can also write tests against the end state of our deployed resources with integration tests. So if we look back at the resources that we're deploying, we can see here that we deploy an index.html file to our S3 bucket. So let's write an integration test that validates that the module deploys this index.html file and that the MD5 hash matches with what we have locally. So to do that, we come back to our test and we're going to implement a run block similar to the above, but instead of using the plan as the command, we're going to switch the commands to apply. Since we want to test that the end resource is in a particular state, we actually need to apply this. This will cause OpenTofu to spin up a one-time short-lived environment with the resources deployed, and we can run tests and assertions against those deployed resources. So the syntax is the same. We use an assert block like we did previously, but now we can access the attributes of our resources that are deployed in state. So we're going to be testing against the S3 test object and make sure that the index.etag matches the MD5 hash of what we currently have on disk. That will validate that the file's been deployed, and if it hasn't, then we'll throw this error message. So let's save that and run tofu test. So you'll notice this time we're running the tofu test, it takes a little longer to run, and that's because it's actually applying this in the background. Whereas when we just do a plan, everything is local and a lot faster. But we can see that's finished, and our deploy HTML test has also passed. So in the background, OpenTofu has spun up a temporary environment, deployed our resources, and then once it's finished with the test, it's torn all that down again. The OpenTofu test framework also has a really useful feature to allow it to evaluate ad hoc submodules during the execution of the test. So this is really useful for realizing resources or data sources that are not provided by a module but needed for testing. So let's assume that we want to write an integration test to ensure our end-to-end deployment is successful, and our benchmark for that is an HTTP 200 response from the website endpoint. So to do that, we need to implement the HTTP provider and set up a data source. Since that doesn't exist in our module, we can easily write a submodule and add that functionality straight to this test. So over here in our tests folder, we're going to create a new subfolder and call that E2E for end-to-end testing. And then within there, we're going to create an OpenTofu configuration file, and we'll just call it main.tf. So we're going to bring in the provider that we need, which is the HTTP provider from HashiCorp. We're going to give it an input, which is going to be the endpoint URL. And then this module is just going to expose a data source from the HTTP provider, which is the result of a GET request to that endpoint URL. So now we've got a module that exists only within our test framework that accepts an endpoint URL as an input and will expose a data source for the HTTP request. So back here in our test file, we can define another run block for our second integration test. If we don't specify the command attribute, then apply will be assumed, so we're just going to skip that. But what we're going to do here is use a module block. And here we're saying that for this test, we want to import this module, which we have under our test directory /E2E, and that will evaluate that module in the context of this test. We then need to set the input variable that that module is going to use, and we do that by declaring a variables block. The interesting thing here to note is that we can reference the outputs of previous tests in our variable block here. So let's just have a recap of where all these variables are coming from. So when we run our deploy HTML test here, we applied our module, and as part of applying that module, we have the module output here, which is endpoint. So now we come back to the test here, what we can see happening here is that we can reference that output from this apply run by going run.deployhtml.endpoint. Now we're assigning that to a variable called endpoint URL. An endpoint URL is the input for our submodule that we created to do the HTTP request. So hopefully that's straightforward enough. We'll come back to our tests. And now we can write an assert block to test the output of our submodule. And here we're just going to verify that the submodule that did the HTTP request to our endpoint URL has returned an HTTP code of 200. And if not, then we raise this error message. So the important thing now to note is because we've added a submodule and that submodule brings in providers, before we run tofu test, we just need to run a tofu init. And that will not only initialize the E2E module that we created, but also pull in the HTTP provider that it depends on. Once we've done that, we can run a tofu test once more. And now we can see that we have a full, albeit simple, end-to-end test that actually resolves the endpoint. So we've just seen how we can do 4 different types of tests in OpenTofu. We can do a basic unit test to test the behavior of our code and make sure that our variables are interpolating correctly. We can do unit tests to make sure that we're getting failures where we expect to get those failures. We can do integration tests to actually test the state of deployed resources. And we've used submodules to expose data sources that aren't available in our module but are needed by our tests. So now with OpenTofu, we have the ability to write unit and integration tests to ensure the stability of the modules that we write. Having confidence in your deployments is key to maintaining a stable infrastructure. Testing our code is a fundamental part of maintaining stability, but it merely scratches the surface of a comprehensive testing and compliance strategy. Having true confidence in your deployments means scrutinizing your CI/CD pipeline from code to production. And for that, you need to be using a platform like Spacelift. Spacelift offers unparalleled testing and control capabilities across the entire deployment lifecycle. Spacelift lets you use policies to enforce checks and balances in all decision points across your workflow, and automate your CI/CD pipeline with the highest level of visibility and control. Click the link below and sign up for a free trial and see how Spacelift can take your CI/CD automation up to the next level. I hope this video has been helpful, and as usual, please hit that like button and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. I'm Craig Dunn, developer advocate over at Spacelift. Until the next time.